I wasn't looking for giants when I started this investigation. I was deep into something far more mundane, tracing the provenance of oversized architectural fixtures that kept appearing in 19th century state auctions across the American Midwest. Door frames, mantelpieces, stone lintels carved from single blocks that no modern crane operator would envy lifting into place. I was building a catalog, cross-referencing auction records with demolition permits from the 1880s and 1890s, try to understand why so many grand structures were being quietly dismantled before the age of photography had fully matured. It was archival work. Slow, deliberate, the kind of research that produces footnotes rather than headlines. And then I found the bones. Not physically, I want to be clear about that. I found the records of them. Newspaper accounts, surveyors' field notes, Smithsonian correspondence files that had been partially declassified and then very quietly re-archived under different catalog numbers. What I found were descriptions of skeletal remains, human in every proportion except scale, being unearthed from burial mounds across Ohio, Tennessee, and the upper Mississippi Valley throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and into the first decade of the 20th century. Remains that measured between 7 and 12 feet in length. Remains with double rows of teeth. Remains that the official record insists either never existed, were misidentified, or were quietly transferred to institutions from which they have never reemerged. That was the moment the official explanations began to collapse, not with a dramatic revelation, with a silence, a specific, deliberate, institutional silence that, once you learn to recognize its shape, you start seeing absolutely everywhere. Let me begin with the physical evidence, because that is where every serious investigation must begin, not with folklore, not with mythology, not with the kind of breathless speculation that dismisses itself before it can be examined, with documented, cataloged, physically described material evidence that exists in the historical record and has been systematically ignored. In 1879, a burial mound near Brewersville, Indiana was excavated by a team that included the county surveyor. What they found was formally documented. A skeleton measuring 9 feet, 8 inches from crown to heel. The documentation described the skull as proportionally massive, the jaw containing a double row of molars, and the bones exhibiting a density that the surveyor compared, in his own words, to petrified oak rather than human calcium. This wasn't a fever dream reported by an illiterate farmer. This was a surveyor's field report, submitted to the county and subsequently referenced in the Indianapolis News on November 10th of that same year. The Smithsonian Institution was notified, men arrived, the remains were crated and transported. And then, nothing. The specimen does not appear in any Smithsonian catalog from that period that has been made publicly available. When researchers in the early 20th century attempted to follow up, they were told the remains had been lost in transit or misidentified as animal bones upon closer examination. The surveyor's original field notes have not been located, but Indiana is only the beginning. In 1883, a mound complex near Crittenden, Nevada yielded what witnesses described as 19 skeletons, the largest measuring nearly 11 feet, with markings on the skull suggesting intentional cranial elongation. Except the cranial capacity of these specimens was already so far beyond the human norm that elongation would have been entirely unnecessary. The Nevada State Journal ran a detailed account. The bones were described as being accompanied by carved stone tablets bearing symbols that no linguist from the University of California, who was consulted at the time, could identify as belonging to any known writing system. 3 months after that consultation, the tablets were gone. The bones followed. What strikes me most about these accounts, and I have spent considerable time with a microfilm, reading the originals rather than secondary sources, is the grain of their consistency. These are not stories that echo each other, because one reporter copied from another. The details diverge in the ways that genuine independent observation always diverges. The Indiana surveyor focuses on density and measurement. The Nevada witnesses focus on the accompanying artifacts. A 1891 account from Lovelock Cave describes the red hair preserved on the skulls, a detail so specific and so strange that no sensationalist would have invented it, because it raises more questions than it answers. The shadows of these accounts fall correctly. They were documented before anyone had reason to coordinate a hoax. They predate the very culture of mystery entertainment that would later make such stories profitable to fabricate. The official explanation, when one is offered at all, is that 19th century excavators were poor judges of scale, prone to exaggeration, working without proper archaeological training. Perhaps, but surveyors measure for a living, and the pattern of institutional collection followed by institutional silence is not an explanation. It is the thing that requires explaining. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now here is where my investigation took a turn I did not anticipate, because I had assumed in my comfortable academic way that this was an American phenomenon, a product of frontier mythology, of a young nation hungry for a heroic prehistory to rival the ancients of Europe. And then the geographical pattern began to emerge, and it shattered that assumption entirely. In St. Petersburg, in the basement archives of the Kunstkamera, Russia's oldest museum, founded by Peter the Great in 1714 specifically to catalog natural and human anomalies, there are references in the original acquisition logs to skeletal specimens of unusual size collected from the steppes of Central Asia during the 18th century. The logs describe them in clinical, Enlightenment-era language, which is precisely why they are credible. No drama, just measurements. 7 feet, 3 inches. 8 feet, 1 inch. Provenance listed as the Ob River Basin. Current location of these specimens, unverified. In Buenos Aires, excavation reports from the Pampas during the 1890s, filed by European settlers and reviewed by Argentine government geologists, describe burial sites containing individuals of extraordinary stature alongside tools scaled appropriately for hands significantly larger than any living humans. The measurements of these tools will become important later in this investigation. For now, note only that Buenos Aires and Indiana share no cultural mythology, no trade route, no common colonial heritage that would explain identical anomalies appearing in identical institutional silence. In Delhi, Sanskrit texts that predate British colonization by centuries describe the Daityas and Danavas, a race of beings whose proportional descriptions, when translated without the theological overlay, consistently indicate physical dimensions 2 to 3 times those of ordinary men. These are not metaphors for power. Ancient Indian poetry uses separate, specific metaphorical language for power. These descriptions are anatomical. In the highlands of Ecuador in 1964, Father Carlos Vaca, a Salesian priest and amateur archaeologist, documented a collection of giant bones found in the Uchique region. His measurements were witnessed, co-signed by local officials, and submitted to the Catholic Church's own archival system. The bones were subsequently sent to Rome. They have not been returned, displayed, or formally acknowledged. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, not just the existence of the remains, but the discovery, the documentation, the institutional collection, and the silence, occurring in countries that had no diplomatic relationship with each other, in cultures that had no shared mythology at the time of discovery, in archives separated by oceans and centuries, and always, always the same shape of disappearance. Who were they built for? Or rather, who are they? And here is where the map changes. Literally. Because if you obtain a copy of Guillaume Delisle's 1706 map of Asia, not a reproduction, but high-quality scan an original, the kind available through the Bibliothèque Nationale de France's digital archive, you'll find printed clearly across the Central Asian steppe a political designation that no modern textbook includes in its history of civilizations. Tartaria, or in its fuller form, Tartaria Magna, Great Tartary, not a legend, not a myth, a named, cartographically designated territory that appears on European maps from the 16th century through the early 19th century, covering an area larger than the entirety of modern Russia west of the Urals. It appears on Dutch maps, French maps, English maps, Jesuit missionary maps. It appears in the encyclopedias of the era. Diderot's own encyclopedia includes an entry for it. It was real enough that European diplomats worried about it, real enough that trade routes through it were documented, real enough that its population was described, its governors named, its customs cataloged. And then, somewhere in the first half of the 19th century, it stops, not conquered in any war we study, not renamed by any treaty we can find in the standard historical record, not absorbed through any documented process of political assimilation. The maps simply change. The name disappears. The territory becomes a blank administrative patchwork of Russian provinces and Chinese frontier regions, and the civilization, if that is what it was, that had occupied that space for centuries becomes, in the official record, nothing more than a vague reference to medieval Mongol movements. The connection to our giant becomes impossible to ignore once you understand what Tartaria's geographical footprint actually encompasses. The Ob River Basin, where the Kunstkammer's oversized specimens were collected. The Central Asian steppes, where 18th century European travelers consistently reported encountering ruins of buildings whose doorways stood 12 to 14 feet tall. The corridor connecting the great civilizational centers of the ancient world. Mesopotamia to the south, China to the east, the emerging European states to the west. A corridor through which something or someone once moved freely. I am not claiming that Tartaria was a nation of giants. I am noting that the territory which has been most thoroughly removed from our historical consciousness is precisely the territory from which the most persistent accounts of giant remains have emerged. That convergence is not something I can dismiss, no matter how much my academic training tells me try. Now, let's talk about the newspapers. Because the 19th century, for all its limitations, was an era of voracious documentation. Local papers covered local excavations with the same obsessive detail. They applied to courthouse fires and county fair results. And what the newspapers reveal, when you read them systematically rather than an isolated quotation, is a story of discovery so consistent that it becomes its own form of evidence. The Laramie Daily Boomerang, 1886. A report of mound excavations near the Wyoming border yielding bones of man or creature of prodigious stature, estimated by our county physician at no less than 8 feet in height, the skull alone weighing what the physician reckoned at 4 times that of an ordinary man. The Memphis Daily Appeal, 1877. A detailed account of a burial site on the Tennessee Bluffs containing 7 individuals of unusual size. The report including an interview with the lead excavator, who noted the teeth were worn flat in a manner suggesting a diet of extraordinary coarseness or extraordinary duration, or both. The Worthington Advance, Minnesota, 1882, a surveyor's account of a single skeleton found during railroad grading operations, measuring 10 feet 2 inches, accompanied by copper implements of unknown function that the local blacksmith estimated would have required hands with a span of at least 14 inches to grip comfortably. The St. Paul Globe, 1888, a follow-up piece specifically noting that remains reported 2 years earlier had been collected by representatives of the Smithsonian Institution, and that inquiries to that institution had produced no response whatsoever. The Arizona Silver Belt, 1891. Perhaps the most striking of all, an account of a cave system near Globe, Arizona, in which the excavating party discovered not individual remains, but what appeared to be a burial chamber containing dozens of individuals of unusual size, along with carved stonework that one member of the party, a trained stonemason from Philadelphia, described as requiring techniques not consistent with any hand tool I have ever used or studied. And then 1920, the reports stop. It is not that the mound stopped being excavated. It is not that the newspapers stopped printing excavation stories. It is that this particular category of discovery simply ceases to appear in the record. The photographs stop. The reports stop. The maps change. The specific institutional conduit, the Smithsonian Collection System, had by that point had for decades to quietly absorb whatever the American landscape had been offering up, and the record produced from that absorption is one of studied institutional incompleteness. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. Not a supernatural theory, not an appeal to ancient aliens or divine intervention, a functional, historically coherent explanation for what the evidence consistently suggests. What if the official story of human prehistory, the neat linear progression from small scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture to city-states to modern civilization, is not false, exactly, but incomplete in a way that is not accidental? What if there existed, prior to the civilizational reset that the 19th century seems to document in its silences, a population of human beings, genuinely human, biologically related to us, but distinct in their physical scale, whose existence would require us to rewrite not just our history books, but our fundamental understanding of who we are and where we came from? Why would that be erased? The logic is not complicated. A civilization that can point to a coherent, unbroken human story, from small beginnings to present glory, is a civilization that can justify its current power structures as a natural outcome of natural progress. The powerful are powerful because humanity progressed, and they are the inheritors of that progress. But a civilization that had acknowledged a predecessor of greater physical scale, potentially of greater architectural and organizational capacity, suddenly has a legitimacy problem. It is not the inheritor of progress. It is a survivor, or possibly the beneficiary, of a catastrophe, who controls the narrative of catastrophe, controls everything that comes after it. Which institutions were positioned in the late 19th and early 20th century to absorb physical evidence, control academic credentialing, and define the boundaries of legitimate inquiry? Think carefully about that question. Think about which bodies had the resources, the reach, and the motivation to ensure that the surveyor's field notes were refiled, the bones were relocated to inaccessible storage, and the newspaper accounts remained isolated curiosities rather than components of a coherent pattern. I don't have definitive answers, only questions, but the questions have a direction, and that direction points somewhere very specific. They don't debate the evidence. That is the first thing you notice when you attempt to raise these questions in academic settings. They don't engage with the newspaper records and explain why they are fabrications. They don't produce the Smithsonian's chain of custody for specimens and demonstrate their current location. They don't counter the geographical pattern with a more convincing alternative explanation. They pretend it never existed. I have corresponded with 3 separate archaeology departments at major American universities regarding the 19th century mound excavation records. 2 did not respond. 1 responded with a form letter about the ethical obligations of responsible archaeology with respect to indigenous remains, a response that, while not without merit in its own context, was so entirely unrelated to my specific questions about institutional records that it could only have been deliberate. You don't accidentally send a form letter. You send a form letter when you have decided that engagement is more dangerous than silence. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. And passive erasure is, in many ways, more effective than active suppression because it leaves no fingerprints. When something is actively suppressed, there is an order, a decision, a paper trail. When something is passively erased, when the default assumption becomes that it doesn't exist, when graduate students learn not to pursue certain lines of inquiry not because they are forbidden to, but because their advisors' expressions make clear that such inquiries lead nowhere professionally, there is no villain to identify, only a culture of studied and curiosity that perpetuates itself across generations. The same pattern manifests across disciplines. Geologists who find anomalous tool marks on supposedly pre-human stone formations publish quietly in minor journals and find their funding does not renew. Linguists who identify structural similarities between so-called primitive symbol systems and complex grammatical rules that should not be there describe, in private conversation, the peculiar coldness that descends in their departments following such publications. Historians who try to treat Tartary as a subject worthy of serious monographic study discover that the peer review process has a remarkable capacity for finding methodological objections specific to that particular subject that somehow do not apply to comparably sourced scholarship on other pre-modern polities. I am describing something that cannot be proven in a single conversation. I am describing the shape of an absence, and I am asking you to consider whether the shape of an absence can itself be evidence of what once occupied the space. Let me bring you back to the tools. I mentioned them briefly when discussing the Argentine Pampas excavations, and I want to return to them now because they represent a category of evidence that is, if anything, more difficult to dismiss than the bones themselves. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, as American infrastructure expansion was breaking open ground across the continent at an unprecedented rate, construction crews and railroad graders were regularly encountering artifacts in the soil that did not fit the accepted narrative of pre-Columbian North America. Among these artifacts, appearing in enough separate locations across enough separate decades to constitute a pattern, were tools. Specifically, hand tools, adzes, chisels, grinding implements, fashioned from stone and occasionally from metals of unclear provenance, all sharing one consistent characteristic: their scale. An adze found in 1884 during railroad construction near Council Bluffs, Iowa, documented in the railway company's own engineering log, which is not a document designed for sensationalism, measured 23 inches in length with a grip circumference that the engineer noted would require a hand I cannot picture belonging to any man I have encountered. A grinding stone cataloged by the Ohio Historical Society in 1891 before it was transferred to Smithsonian custody weighed, according to the catalog entry, 340 pounds, and yet showed where pattern consistent with regular manual use rather than stationary installation. Something or someone had been moving it. Museum labels, when these objects have made it into display cases at all, describe them as ceremonial objects or communal tools operated by multiple individuals simultaneously. Auction catalog entries from the early 20th century, when some of these objects passed through private hands before institutional collection could reach them, describe them simply as primitive implements of unknown origin. The phrase unknown origin does the work of preventing further inquiry without having to make a falsifiable claim. And yet, hold in your mind the measurements. Hold in your mind the geographical spread. Hold in your mind the accounts of bone density, of skull size, of double rows of teeth, of skeletons measured in feet that exceed the tallest recorded human being in modern medical literature by margins that cannot be explained by severe error alone. And suddenly the tools aren't an anomaly anymore. They're confirmation. I want to return at the end of this investigation to where it began, to the doorframes, to the oversized mantelpieces and the single-block stone lintels that first drew my attention to those estate auction records, because I have since learned what buildings many of those architectural elements came from, and the answer has not left me comfortable. They came from structures that were demolished in the 1880s and 1890s across the American Midwest and South, structures that local records describe as old without being able to specify their age, that were incorporated into early settler communities as public buildings, courthouses, train stations, and civic halls before being torn down as outdated or structurally unsound during the great wave of civic construction that followed the Civil War. Structures that, when you look at the demolition records carefully, were replaced with buildings of nearly identical function, but significantly reduced scale, as if someone had decided, finally, that the old proportions no longer served. Why does every ancient culture remember the giants? The Greeks called them titans. The Hebrews called them Nephilim. The Norse called them Jotnar. The Vedic tradition called them Daityas. The indigenous nations of the American interior called them the Ancient Ones, the first ones, the ones who came before. Why? Across cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared trade route, no common mythological lineage, does the same memory persist with such structural consistency? Why do the bones appear in the ground with such regularity and disappear from the institutional record with such precision? Why does the geographical map of significant discoveries align so closely with the territory that was, until the 19th century, designated on European maps as the domain of a civilization we have been instructed to forget? Why do the tools scale to the bones? Why do the buildings scale to the tools? And why? When researchers ask these questions in institutional settings, does the response take the shape not of refutation, but of silence? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern, a pattern so consistent across centuries and continents and disciplines that the consistency itself becomes the most important data point of all. Whatever was here before us was large enough to leave traces in the earth, in the stone, in the memory of every culture that came after. And something, some force, some institutional logic, some coordinated investment in a particular version of the human story has spent the better part of 2 centuries ensuring that those traces remain disconnected, discredited, and dismissed. I don't have definitive answers. I want to be clear about that, because the absence of definitive answers is not the same as the absence of evidence. What I have are questions, and what the questions suggest is something that should disturb us, not because it is frightening, but because it implies that we have forgotten something fundamental about what we are and what came before us. The door frames are still out there. The lintels, the grinding stones, the carved chambers and the burial mounds that haven't yet been excavated, or that have been excavated and not yet reported, or reported and not yet silenced. The evidence is still in the earth, still in the basements of institutions that have no public catalog for it, still in the handwriting of surveyors and engineers who measured carefully and wrote truthfully and were then carefully ignored. Whatever walked this earth before us, and the evidence suggests something did. It left its mark in mythology of every people who came after. We were told those stories were fantasy. We were told the bones were mistakes. We were told the tools were ceremonial, and the structures were primitive, and the maps were wrong. But the stone remains, and stone, unlike institutional memory, does not choose what to remember.